Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Station 11 episode 8. It's called Who's There? So spoilers for the episode. This is a Patreon sponsored review, so thank you to Allison for picking this show. This is an episode back in the present day, and a lot of the things that we've seen building over the course of the season are starting to really blossom and come together. Obviously we had the Traveling Symphony arrive at the airport previously, but we never really saw most of the characters that we knew from the airport. Whereas this episode, we see Old Man Clark, we see Old Woman Elizabeth, and Miles even, and they like how they've become what they are, the museum. And I will say there was a lot of speculation, and I say that feels weird to say because when I say there's a lot of speculation, I mean by me. I speculate as I was watching the previous few episodes whether or not this airport community, the Museum of Civilization, if they had, turned bad over time, like if there was any truth to Tyler saying that no one leaves alive, and maybe there's some truth to it still, but definitely as we get reintroduced to these characters through the start of the episode, it didn't feel like they were evil. It didn't feel like, oh, this was a sinister place that had really changed necessarily. Clark still felt like Clark, had evolved a little bit. Elizabeth still felt like Elizabeth. If anything, Elizabeth's the one that feels like she's maybe more at peace and maybe in a somewhat better place. Her relationship with Clark does certainly seem a bit more healthy. And one of the big things of this episode is kind of a recontextualization as to maybe why she was so cold to Clark initially. I think she came off being mean-spirited back in like episode 5 when we got the story of the airport, and I think this episode kind of gives us a reason why she was that way towards him by the end of his little sort of flashback subplot. In fact, this may be the most heavily flashback episode that isn't a flashback episode, which is an absurd statement to make, but you know what I mean by that. It's an even numbered episode, it's mostly in the present day, and there's been the odd little glimpse in some episodes to a flashback, but this had like an actual through line of a flashback story as well as the main present day story. And it was a longer episode. It was probably a good 10 minutes longer than the last one. So it almost felt like they didn't even cut down on anything else to add it in. But yeah, we get this story of Clark meeting Arthur whilst he was rehearsing for the play in Chicago and them reconnecting. And, once again, Arthur looks a bit like a dick because he didn't even know that Clark had been 12 years sober. And then by the time they have a fight at the hotel room later that night, Clark's drinking booze again, which really does suggest that Arthur's not good for Clark in many ways. That's not to say that Arthur comes out of this being the asshole necessarily. They do kind of come across as more complex characters who both have their faults, and they're having this debate. And one of the debates they have here is about art and about making stuff, about how important that is, and even the subject of Miranda and her art and how she didn't even care if anyone ever read what she did comes up, whereas Arthur's obsessed with trying to be great and it's important and it matters. And I think that's one of the central debates and themes that the show is really going for, especially since that ties in to the present day story of Clark not wanting the symphony to perform ultimately, right? He's open to it at first, but then starts to worry that maybe Hamlet's going to encourage the youth of his community to perhaps rebel. He's like, oh, he goes against the king in that story. I don't know if we want to be teaching our youths that they should feel angry towards their superiors, to their elders, and want to lash out. So he clearly respects the power of art. He sees it as something that is, can have an impact on the way people think, and is respecting that power, but in a weird way is being cowardly and controlling about it, and doesn't want it to influence them. He's scared of what it might do, and I think there's a lot of nuance to this story. If I never seem amazingly over the moon or super invested, because I think it's clear by this point, we're 2 episodes away from the end now, where I've definitely had sort of mixed feelings about a lot of this show in terms of how much it actually engages me. I do want to make it clear that it's not because it's lacking in terms of something to say, or lacking in terms of complex characters with really interesting themes that it's playing with. It has all those elements. It's very intricate, and not even like sometimes it's actually quite complex in what it's saying when two characters are debating something to the point where I don't even think it's giving you a clear answer as to who is right in a debate about the importance of art and whether it's important to just make the art for yourself, or is it important to be great and be recognized for it? Is it important for it to influence people? You know, there's kind of an irony that Miranda wrote something that she didn't even want people to read, ended up being the most influential work in the post-apocalypse in many ways, only to, you know, two particular people, but they're driving so many things happening in their story that it becomes so important to who's left. So, like, I think there's a lot of interesting choices there. But anyway, to get back to what I was saying about Clark, kind of making a bad impression with Elizabeth and Tyler, where he not only starts drinking after this argument with Arthur, where it brings up all of his demons and whatnot. He full on has a blackout night. He has sex with a stranger, even though he's in a relationship already. That's brought up that he's already met his like long-term partner. He wakes up, he starts drinking booze immediately, and basically tells Arthur that he's sorry that Tyler has him for a father, and you know, it's just in that kind of headspace, only to reveal that Elizabeth is there and has heard every word he just said. Tyler's also there, although he had headphones on, so it's unclear how much of that he heard. But it definitely paints the first scenes they had on the plane in episode 5 a little differently. Like, I think at the time she came across as a little bit of a bitch, the way she was disregarding him like he was beneath her. But then you see this scene and you're like, oh no, he kind of like insulted, and there's a really poignant moment at the end of this scene where Elizabeth's introducing Tyler to Clark, and she says, Clark used to be a friend of your father's. And there's just this lingering moment, and the camera work here really stuck out to me, because they had the shot of Arthur as he hears her say this, where it did that thing where it's the untraditional framing, whereas instead of him looking into the empty space of the frame, he's actually all the way up to the edge of the frame looking at the edge, and all the empty space is behind his head. And it takes him a moment, but he does kind of jump in and correct her and say, no, we're still friends. But even the fact that he jumps in and says that is kind of weird. Because he sort of says it like twice, like he sort of says it and then kind of like, almost like he's confirming it with himself. He's like, no, still friends. We're still friends. Like it's not even like something that could have been taken for granted. Like he's sort of trying to reassure it. He's trying to keep his relationships intact. But he also claims that he never had an affair while he was married to Miranda. He says that everyone assumed that, but he never did. We have nothing to, you know, confirm or deny that, but he seems genuine in the moment when he says it. It is also interesting to me that Clark accuses Arthur of liking people who, you know, aren't alphas, aren't macho, and don't have strong opinions, which, you know, I kind of also would say I dislike that type of person who has to be machismo and all that. But Clark accuses Arthur of only liking people who aren't that because they don't fight back. They just kind of like let him walk all over them because he's a movie star. And Arthur's kind of offended by this, as one might imagine, but that's what Clark thinks at the very least. And, you know, Miranda in many ways was absolutely not that. Miranda was never someone who was just going to give in to whoever Arthur wanted her to be. And it's definitely given as very complex characters where neither of them are completely the good person, right? There's not someone who's right here and the other person's wrong. They're both kind of right about some things. They're both wrong about other things. I think if there's one thing that's clear about this show is that everyone has their demons. Everyone has their things going on. So this idea that Tyler, like his ultimate plan here, obviously he's got his undersea coming at the end, like, but his beacon to them is to blow up the watchtower at the airport with where all the museum stuff is. So Clark has to watch his, like, you know, work of the past 20 years burn in front of him. It's a big sort of dramatic moment at the end of the episode. I think one of the other things I was thinking about in this episode, actually, to sort of pivot to Tyler and Kirsten, is how they're very similar in a lot of ways that they don't realize, but She, of course, we've really established by this point that she has trouble saying goodbye. In fact, that's reiterated in this episode when she goes to see Sarah, who is dying from her heart attack on the sort of the hospital bed in the airport. And one of the last things she says is, you know, you have to, you're not good enough at saying goodbye. You need to get better at that. Or I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact line. But of course, that ties back into what her story was in the flashbacks last time about finally saying goodbye and all that. But also the idea that don't tell them I'm dead until after the play, again, kind of further emphasizing the importance of art in making things and work, and don't put a shadow over it, right? And we started this entire show with an actor dying whilst doing his craft, whilst performing, whilst making something. So there's, again, all these things are recurring, all these things keep coming back up. But so Kirsten is not good at saying goodbye. And that's a form of unhealthy, I won't really quite call that repression. Maybe it kind of is, but is this unhealthy not dealing with things, right? She doesn't actually let things go. Whereas Tyler is the complete opposite in a sort of direct comparison, but the end result is kind of the same in the sense that his motto is literally there was no before, and it really stuck out to me in this episode because he says it, because he's been saying it all show about before the apocalypse, right? The before times. That's what it always meant when he said it. But early in this episode, when Kirsten's kind of saying sorry your friend died in that attack last time, he just sort of quickly says there was no before and moves on. And it definitely painted that phrase now as like, this isn't just about like rebelling against the time from before the apocalypse. Obviously it is that as well, but it's actually just this form of like instant repression, of like not dealing with things that have went through. It's sort of like letting things go rather than, like bottling them up, pretending they don't exist, because then you don't have to deal with it. So it's funny to me that both Tyler and Kirsten are kind of ultimately dealing with how they actually go about their trauma, dealing with how about they move on from things. Both are unhealthy in different ways, but I think the end result is kind of similar for both of them in some senses. I think one of the things that disappointed me in this episode actually is when Kirsten reunites with the Traveling Symphony, and she's happy to see them at first, and then they're all excited to be here, they think it's great, and they're excited to perform. Kirsten immediately is like, okay, what's the plan to escape? What's the plan to get out? What's the plan to get Sarah and leave? And they're all like, there is no plan. We're looking forward to doing the play. This place is great. And we're allowed to stay for like the winter and stuff. And they're all excited about it. And Kirsten immediately is like, no, this place is dangerous. Look at the fence. There's barbed wire. Although, I'm pretty sure the barbed wire on the fence was probably there when this was just an airport. That seems like something that would have been there for airport security before anything else. But I think it bugged me that like almost the very next scene is a scene with Clark and Elizabeth where Clark changes his mind about the play and then says, we can't let them leave. They know how to get here, so we have to keep them contained. It kind of annoyed me that almost immediately the other characters in the airport confirmed that Kirsten was right, that they are trapped here, and that this isn't just like a happy new home for them. That kind of bugged me because I thought there was maybe something more interesting to do with this idea that Kirsten immediately sees a threat here when it might not be. And that's something to kind of explore, like how untrusting she is to an unhealthy degree, and the other characters maybe being right about this place being okay. Having Clark in the very next scene immediately basically say, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're going to keep them here because we can't trust them. Kind of like muddied the waters there for me in terms of being excited about, like, because it's just like, oh, she's just immediately right? I think it's more interesting if she's wrong about that, at least partially. But, it is what it is. So, I mean, what else did we get up to in this episode? Obviously, at the end, we have the tower blow up. We have Elizabeth, knowing that this is her son now. He doesn't speak to her. It's not until Clark shows up that he starts actually saying things, and he yells, he screams. Interestingly, that's something that Clark was doing on the phone earlier as like advice for people of, in his like CEO whispering job before. And now at the end, he's been yelled at in kind of a similar fashion with swearing. It's this sort of try to take back some form of control. And, Tyler keeps saying, you're bringing it all back. You brought the before back, and I'm ending it. He does admit to Kirsten, admittedly, that like there is a before, it just really sucked. Basically, they have like this like heart to heart scene where Kirsten kind of like tells him who she is. She's realized, presumably through him talking about his mum being here, who his mum is. Because earlier on in the episode, she has this moment where she finds out that who Elizabeth is, where they say her full name, and she has this like holy shit moment. So there's a whole scene towards the end of this episode before Tyler does his final hurrah, where she is like, I was in a play with Arthur, and we were supposed to meet on the night of the premiere, but you guys were late and didn't make it. And then, of course, Arthur died. And it's this whole thing where their fates have been kind of intertwined, and they were supposed to meet all those years ago. I thought that was interesting. I think the other big thing, of course, this episode is kind of some of the payoff to the Station 11 stuff itself. It sets up quite neatly early on in the episode that he remembers most of the scenes and most of the words from when he was young. He got rid of the book, but he remembers most of it, and he's been reading Kirsten's copy while she was asleep from the poison. And it sets up that he knows most of it. So when they're taken in and Clark is suspicious of them and wants to interrogate them and they're saying they're actors, he immediately kind of believes Kirsten, because when she says who she is, the other troupe have all mentioned her and that she was left behind and whatever. So he knows that there's some validity to her story, but isn't quite as ready to believe Tyler. So he says, perform a scene. So they end up performing a scene from Station 11. I actually thought this was a really nice little payoff, because we've already had Kirsten perform scenes from Station 11 in the backstory, and it's the one thing that she knows that Tyler's going to know. He's going to know the words, he's going to know how the scene goes. So it's kind of a nice little payoff where it comes together. But it's one of these things where, like, I appreciate it all coming together, but at the same time, it did sort of remind me how connected every character is. You know, like Miranda, Arthur, Clark, Elizabeth, Tyler, Kirsten, they're all so connected. I think it's also part of the reasons why I really like the Jeevan and Kirsten relationship, is that Jeevan is not connected to anyone. Oh, obviously his brother, but we meet him through Jeevan. But Jeevan isn't connected to any of that like lineage, right? They're all intertwined, and it's that thing where the universe, the world feels a little bit small because of it, and it just feels a bit too much. Whereas Jeevan feels so separate, and his story that he builds up with Kirsten is just built on meeting in that one chance encounter in episode 1 and building from there, and everything has meaning because of what happens to them after they meet, right? Whereas it feels like every other character connected to Arthur, and he's kind of the link in many ways, but they're all intertwined to a not an absurd degree, but given how separate everyone was and how everyone's kind of coming back together, like, you know, there's times when that really works and it's kind of nice, but then there's other times where you have the, like, when you get the characters realizing that they have these connections that they didn't know about, that's where it kind of feels a little bit like, if you have too much of that, it starts to feel a bit contrived almost. And I'm not necessarily saying it did here, but I was aware of it. You know, as some of these scenes were playing out, I was kind of aware of it. I think Kirsten telling Arthur they were supposed to meet because she knew Arthur and she was working with him in the play, I think that worked well enough. I think that's a nice scene that was performed well. It might be the most I've enjoyed adult Kirsten in the show, to be honest, is that moment. And maybe it's because she's talking about her childhood in those first 100 days. But yeah. The other thing, of course, with Kirsten in the bookend of the episode is like a little another scene with her at the apartment explaining what she thinks Station 11's about. And it kind of ends in this ambiguous note of like them saying to her, oh, what does it mean to you? Forget what the authors try to say. What does this art mean to you? And that's kind of the final sort of poignant kind of like question we end the episode on, which, you know, I assume will lead to some interesting things over the next couple of episodes. Yeah, it's, you know, like we're dealing with grief, we're dealing with how people cope with things, and we're dealing with the idea of what we create, both in terms of art, but also in terms of society. Like, you know, this entire societal structure. I mean, Clark, even before the apocalypse, was someone who was in the world of art and wasn't that successful at it, but it was important to him. And then he gave that up and he became someone in the corporate world, someone where it wasn't an artistic pursuit. And then in the post-apocalypse, he ended up being able to use his more, I don't know, logical side, the less artistic side, to just like form this society at the airport. He kind of built structure. He built these things. And it's interesting that he almost feels like a jealousy and a fear when the kids at the airport are excited about seeing a play for the first time. Like he's mad that they're not interested in his karaoke machine when he's going through his museum items and whatnot. He's trying to teach them things about the world before, and they're excited to be entertained. They're excited to be lost in a story. I pity them though, because they're going to get Hamlet, which, you know, I've made my opinions on Shakespeare clear at this point. But he he very much is sort of grumpy, and he sort of like storms out, kind of just annoyed that they're not really excited about what he's showing them, and they're more excited about the play. There's a little bit there of like this world he left behind, and was kind of almost happy to be away from like the failure of that. I guess, like this is something he left, and he says to Arthur in the flashback in this episode that he's not jealous. He doesn't want to be that. Necessarily, but he does accuse Arthur of just being great at it without deserving it. Like he just naturally is. And I think in some level he is dealing with this feeling of like he's been important to this community, right? He became the most important person here, right? He found this sense of purpose. And then there's almost this air of like maybe that's going to be taken away. There's even that scene when he's with Miles and he's like, do people still like me here? Right? Do people like me? And Miles tries to reassure him. In fact, there's even a scene early on where he's at like a group therapy kind of thing, and he's admitting that he's always felt that when he walks in a room, people don't like him. And he knows that's not necessarily true, but he understands it and even accepts it. So it's really dealing with like how he feels about himself, how he feels about how others see him, his insecurities. Like that's something that's still at play here. It's still motivating much of what he does. I mean, to go back to him saying he doesn't want the play to happen now because he's worried that Hamlet might influence the younger people, that they can rebel against the older people. Yes, there's one side of that that's maybe like a purely cold, logical, like he's doing it for this idea of like this society might break down. But you could also look at it as he's the older person and he wants to be liked by the younger people. He doesn't want to teach them that they can rebel against him specifically, because then he's not the important one anymore. Like, how much of that is coming from a place of like selfish insecurity, whether or not he's aware of that he's doing it or not. Like he might feel completely justified. He might have convinced himself that he's making these choices the best way he can for the right reasons. But we're looking at it from a bird's eye view. We can compare what he's doing with other people, and he doesn't necessarily feel like this squeaky clean character. That's not to say that he's not done good things, that he's not helped these people survive. He absolutely has. But when you see like the backwards and forwards and the downward spirals of the flashbacks, and you see his decisions here call into question someone being scared of losing something, being scared of losing what he built. And after all, this entire show is about everyone losing the world that we built as a society. The world as we knew it was lost, and he has tried to rebuild some fragment of that, and all of it's based around remembering what we had. Here's the karaoke machine, here's this, here's that. He's scared of losing what he has, and that's kind of what's driving him. Tyler, on the other side, is angry at what was and wants to tear it down for something new. Now, whether or not he has actually a strong idea of what he wants to come after that, I don't know. That could be, like, again, the fundamental flaw in Tyler's character. Aside from just the fact that he was using children as suicide bombers. So, like, that was one of the things that was in my head, actually, is Kirsten was, like, having that sort of heart-to-heart scene with him. As I was thinking, okay, I get this, and I understand it, and whatever, but in the back of my head, I'm like, he's still a monster. He's still done unforgivable things that I can't just let go. So I'm curious to see how they treat Tyler's character as we get to the end of the story. If they're going to try and like give characters redemption of some kind, if it's going to be a bit more nuanced than that. I'm not sure where it's going with some of that stuff. So we'll see. I'm definitely curious to see how it wraps things up. We got 2 episodes left, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next one. So thanks again to Allison for sponsoring and picking the show. I'll see you guys next time. You can, of course, support everything over at Patreon for as little as $3 per month and help support all the content, or you can be a YouTube member, of course. More bonuses on Patreon, but hey, if you prefer a YouTube membership, also great. Any help is vastly appreciated and is what makes this possible, both on this channel and the Male Fuzz movies. So thank you very much for joining. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?